The sky above Lorraine was a dull, pale gray on the morning of September 19th, 1944. A wet fog blanketed the rolling fields, muffling every sound except for the distant thrum of heavy engines. Out of that mist, the armored columns of the 113th Panzer Brigade advanced east of Arracourt, their Panther tanks crawling forward like metal beasts through a half-formed dream. Visibility was so poor that German commanders could barely make out their own lead vehicles. Then, a sound none of them could place cut through the fog, high-pitched, sharp, almost like the scream of a small aircraft. It was nothing like the deep, thunderous rumble of a Panther's Maybach engine. Crews froze for an instant, straining to see. Shapes materialized low to the ground, smaller than anything they expected. Muzzles flashed once, twice, 3 times in rapid succession. Before the German gunners could even traverse their turrets, the silhouettes were gone, swallowed again by the mist. The first exchange lasted less than 20 seconds. 3 Panthers were already burning. Colonel Erich von Fonsendorf, commanding the brigade, had drilled his men to expect Sherman's slower, less agile, easier prey. What he faced now defied every assumption in German doctrine. Enemy vehicles moved with impossible speed, striking from unexpected angles, vanishing before counterfire could be coordinated. Veteran crews, accustomed to deliberate engagements, were reduced to spinning turrets against ghosts. In those moments, the battlefield itself became the enemy. The fog was no longer just weather. It was cover, a weapon. Radios crackled with fragmented reports, enemy tank destroyers, fast, multiple directions. But by the time a position was relayed, the attackers were already gone, appearing elsewhere like wraiths. What the Germans had stumbled into that morning was not a conventional tank duel. It was an ambush, orchestrated by M18 Hellcats, American tank destroyers that broke every rule the Wehrmacht relied upon. Where German vehicles wore their armor like a fortress, these machines fought like predators, surviving through speed, not steel. Each Hellcat carried a 76 gun, but its real advantage wasn't firepower. It was movement. With the fog as their ally, the American crews executed a brutal rhythm: fire, relocate, strike again. The Panther turret, which needed close to a minute for a full traverse at low engine speeds, could never keep up with a machine that could sprint over 50 miles per hour across open ground. One by one, German tankers realized their battlefield logic was collapsing. The angles they had trained to dominate were irrelevant. The timing they had perfected for years was useless. The hunters had become the hunted, and they couldn't even see the stalkers. The engagement at Arracourt would stretch into hours, but its opening minutes left a permanent mark. German tank doctrine had met something it was never built to fight, a machine designed to move faster than fear itself. And for the men in those Panthers, the enemy wasn't a line of tanks. It was the sound of a scream in the fog, followed by fire. In December 1941, just weeks after Pearl Harbor, a tall, sharp-eyed cavalry officer stepped into a War Department briefing room in Washington. His name was Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Bruce, and he carried a heretical idea. For 2 years, German panzer divisions had crushed Europe under a doctrine built on speed and concentration of force. Poland had fallen in barely a month. France, once proud of its massive army, collapsed in 6 weeks. To Bruce, it wasn't their armor thickness or gun caliber that won those battles. It was movement. Blitzkrieg was a tempo, not just a tactic. America's armored forces were young, inexperienced, and badly outmatched. But Bruce saw an opening where others saw a disadvantage. If Germany's tanks were built to push through defenses, then the US could build something designed to hunt them down. Dawn set, match them pound for pound, Bruce argued. At the time, American planners imagined tank destroyers as slow, turretless guns dug in along defensive lines, mobile artillery with tracks. Bruce envisioned the opposite: a fast, aggressive vehicle that could intercept, ambush, and disappear before the enemy could react. His vision gave birth to an idea that would overturn decades of armored warfare thinking, a tank destroyer that used speed as armor. The requirements for this new Predator were issued within weeks. It had to be light, agile, and armed with a capable gun. Early sketches called for a 37mm weapon, then reality intervened. German armor was getting heavier with each campaign. The 37mm became 57mm, then 75. Finally, engineers settled on the 76mm gun, a weapon that could threaten even the feared Panther's frontal armor if aimed well. By mid-1942, designers wrestled with the vehicle's heart, how to give a tracked machine the speed of a wheeled scout car. The revolutionary answer lay not in heavier engines, but in stripping everything else down. Minimal armor, lightweight frame, advanced suspension, and an aircraft-derived radial engine that could deliver bursts of raw speed most tankers thought impossible. When Buick's T-70 prototype roared across a test track in 1943, Army observers watched in disbelief. It wasn't crawling like a tank. It was gliding like a Predator, silent at distance, violent up close. 40, 50 miles an hour. No tracked combat vehicle in the world had moved like this before. In Berlin, German intelligence received fragmentary reports of the new American tank destroyer. They laughed. To them, a machine with thin armor and a light frame was suicide against real tanks. The Wehrmacht believed killing power meant mass and steel, not speed. Their Jagd Panthers and Tigers embodied that logic, fortresses on tracks. But Bruce and his team were building something different. A hunter, not a brawler. As production plans solidified, the vehicle gained a name that perfectly matched its purpose: Hellcat. It wasn't meant to stand toe-to-toe. It was meant to outthink, outrun, and outfight before the enemy understood what hit them. What began as a radical briefing in a smoky Washington office was now a blueprint that would rewrite the rules of tank combat. The first time the M18 Hellcat showed its teeth, it wasn't on the open plains of France, but in the rugged, shell-pocked countryside near Anzio, Italy. On May 23, 1944, the German Hermann Göring Panzer Division was moving to blunt the Allied breakout. Its Panthers and Panzer IVs rumbled forward, confident. They had faced Shermans before, slow-moving and predictable targets. Then, out of the olive groves came something different. The German crews saw only flashes at first, thin silhouettes hugging the terrain, muzzles snapping, shells streaking toward them with unnerving precision. One Panther went up in flames, then another in less than a minute. 2 German tanks had been destroyed, and the attackers were gone, leaving only drifting smoke and radio confusion in their wake. The division's SEPST after-action report captured their disbelief in clipped, formal language. Enemy employs new tank destroyer type. Vehicle speed estimated 70 to 80 kilometers per hour. Return fire ineffective due to rapid displacement. To veteran Panzer commanders, this sounded impossible. Tanks didn't move that fast. Tank destroyers certainly didn't. But the Hellcat wasn't playing by their rulebook. The M18 Sense that day used the same rhythm that would soon make them infamous: appear, strike fast, vanish. They never tried to slug it out. They attacked like cavalry. Fluid, mobile, uncatchable. In Berlin, the report was dismissed as exaggeration born of battlefield stress. German analysts, steeped in a doctrine that equated survivability with armor, couldn't accept that a thin-skinned vehicle could outfight them. But the men who survived that engagement knew the truth. Something new was loose on the battlefield, something they couldn't pin down or predict. The Hellcat's baptism of fire had been brief, but it sent ripples all the way to the German high command. What they thought was a myth would soon prove to be a very real, very fast nightmare. At first light on September 19, 1944, the fog over Lorraine clung to the earth like wet wool. Visibility dropped to just a few dozen meters, and every sound was swallowed whole. Inside the advancing columns of the 113th Panzer Brigade, tension was a living thing. Their orders were simple: break through the thin American line near Arracourt, seize the high ground, and roll the Third Army back before it could consolidate. The Panthers at the front crept forward, cautiously. The mist made them blind, then the silence cracked. A flash flared through the fog, followed by a sharp, unfamiliar scream of a high-revving engine. A shell slammed into the lead Panther. Flames bloomed. Within minutes, the German spearhead was under attack from nowhere. What the brigade could not yet see were the Hellcats of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, concealed along the flanks of the American 4th Armored Division. Lieutenant Edwin Leiper and his platoon had spent the night studying the terrain, picking positions that offered maximum concealment and quick exit routes. Their orders were clear: don't stand and trade blows, strike, move, strike again. At 400 to 800 yards, they opened fire. The Hellcats moved with the rhythm of a prizefighter. Jab, slip, counter. German tankers struggled to react, their turret traverse too slow, their sightlines too narrow. They came out of the fog like wraiths. One German gunner recalled after the war, "You could hear them, then you said it'd see the flash, and then they were somewhere else." In the space of 30 minutes, Leiper's platoon knocked out 15 German tanks. Darting between positions faster than German commanders could reorient their formations. Sergeant Henry Rod Hartman, holding the platoon's flank, became a legend that morning. His gunner destroyed 6 Panthers in rapid succession, each hit followed by an immediate relocation before a single round of return fire could land. Colonel von Fonsendorf's brigade was unraveling. German doctrine was built for deliberate, long-range duels against slower opponents. But here, they were being hunted by enemies they couldn't pin down. Radio traffic dissolved into panicked fragments. Commands overlapped. Units lost cohesion. By the time the fog lifted slightly mid-morning, 39 Panthers lay destroyed, scattered across the damp fields. 11 more were disabled or abandoned. The Hellcats had lost only a handful of vehicles, most not from direct fire, but from artillery or mechanical damage. What made the engagement devastating wasn't just the kill count. It was the way the battle rewrote the tempo. German tankers had trained for encounters measured in minutes, deliberate positioning, coordinated volleys. The Hellcats compressed that timeline into seconds. Every Panther turret lagged behind. Every maneuver came too late. When reports reached the German 5th Panzer Army, disbelief turned to alarm. The enemy was moving at unthinkable speed, and they weren't fighting like tanks. They were fighting like hunters. For the Americans, Arracourt became a case study. The battle validated everything Bruce had imagined 3 years earlier. It proved that mobility, when executed with precision, could dismantle even superior armor. For the Germans, it was a brutal revelation. The battlefield they thought they controlled had changed shape beneath their feet. As the sun burned through the last of the fog that afternoon, the fields around Arracourt were littered with wrecked Panthers, smoking monuments to a doctrine that had finally met something faster than itself. The German Panzer Corps built their war machines on a simple equation: the thicker the armor, the longer you survived. Their Panthers and Tigers were rolling fortresses, heavily plated, heavily armed, and terrifying at range. But the M18 Hellcat didn't play by that math. It rewrote it entirely. Where a Panther weighed nearly 45 tons, the Hellcat tipped the scales at just 17.7. It was 3 times lighter and more than twice as fast. Its designers had stripped it down to the essentials: speed, agility, and a turret that moved as fast as its gunner's instincts. A Panther's turret, for all its engineering brilliance, was a slave to its engine. At idle, it could take close to a minute to rotate fully, precious seconds on a battlefield measured in heartbeats. The The Hellcat's hydraulic traverse could spin its turret a full 360 degrees in 24 seconds, no matter the engine's speed. While a Panther labored to follow a moving target, the Hellcat could already be on its second or third firing position. But raw speed was its real weapon. At top gear, the Hellcat could sprint across a 400-meter killing field in just over 16 seconds. Less time than it took a Tiger's gunner to traverse 90 degrees. In effect, it didn't need to absorb hits. It just needed to not be there when the return shot came. The secret lay under its thin skin. A Wright R975 radial engine adapted from aircraft. Air-cooled, lightweight, and pushing 400 horsepower, it gave the Hellcat a power-to-weight ratio of over 22 horsepower per ton. A Panther, by contrast, lumbered along at about 15. That difference turned every battlefield into a chessboard. One side moving knights, the other moving pawns. German crews encountered the Hellcat and felt something alien. It didn't behave like a tank. It darted, disappeared, and reappeared at impossible angles. Their manuals, their gunnery tables, their training, none of it accounted for a tracked vehicle moving this fast. Even its transmission was built to complement that philosophy. The Torque-O-Matic automatic gearbox eliminated the need for manual clutching. The driver could focus entirely on maneuvering, hitting top speeds faster than most tanks could even shift gears. But speed came at a price. The Hellcat's armor was wafer-thin, 25 mm at its thickest, barely enough to stop a heavy machine gun at close range. Where a Panther could shrug off shells, the Hellcat had to survive by never giving the enemy a clean shot. This was the genius of the design, and its gamble. The Americans didn't intend for the Hellcat to brawl in city streets or slug it out in long-range duels. They built a machine to exploit fleeting moments, to outmaneuver, to frustrate, to break the enemy's rhythm. In a war defined by firepower and steel, the Hellcat won its battles by owning time. The winter fog rolled across the Ardennes like a curtain, swallowing roads, forests, and fields in a heavy silence. It was December 19, 1944, the third day of Hitler's last desperate gamble, the Ardennes offensive. Columns of the 2nd Panzer Division pushed toward the crossroads at Neuville, a choke point that could open the way to Bastogne and, beyond that, Antwerp. The Germans had momentum. They did not expect to be hunted by ghosts. 4 M18 Hellcats, belonging to the 609th and 705th Tank Destroyer Battalions, waited along the tree line outside the village. Their crews sat still, engines low, eyes scanning the fog like predators at the edge of a kill zone. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but they had something the German Panthers didn't. They could move faster than the battle itself. When the lead German tanks emerged, their outlines were barely visible, gray shadows in the mist. The first shot came from an American position the Germans hadn't even noticed. A Panther exploded in a ball of flame. Seconds later, the Hellcats vanished backward into the fog, leaving only ringing ears and confusion behind. Then they struck again, from another angle, and another. To the German tankers, it felt like they were fighting an entire battalion. In reality, they were facing just 4 vehicles, dancing between prepared firing positions, firing 2 or 3 rounds, then disappearing before the Panthers could traverse their guns. The fog made the deception perfect. The 2nd Panzer Division SIP's war diary recorded its frustration with a cold precision. Encountered strong tank destroyer resistance at Neuville. Enemy vehicles of high mobility operating in fog, unable to effectively engage due to rapid displacement of targets. Attack suspended pending reinforcement. The delay cost them more than pride. Those 48 hours bought by the Hellcats gave the 101st Airborne time to reinforce Bastogne, sealing a defensive line that would ultimately help blunt the German offensive. For the Hellcat crews, Neuville was proof of concept. Their machine wasn't just fast, it could shape the battlefield. They didn't need to overpower their enemies. They needed to confuse them, slow them, and control the tempo. The fog had become their greatest ally, and the Germans were trapped inside it. By late 1944, the Hellcat's reputation had spread across German armored formations. What had once been dismissed as an American curiosity was now viewed with wary respect. Reports from frontline units described vehicles that could strike without warning and vanish before counterfire could be organized. It was a new kind of battlefield predator, and the Wehrmacht knew it had to respond. The 5th Panzer Army issued revised tactical guidance. Don't waste time trying to rotate turrets against something faster than your gun. Instead, pre-position Panthers to cover likely approaches. Lay ambushes. Use infantry with Panzerfaust to cover flanks. Call in artillery to pound suspected firing positions. And above all, never pursue. Chasing a Hellcat was a race the Germans could not win. On paper, the strategy made sense. In practice, it collapsed under pressure. German armored doctrine was built on deliberate engagements, precise gunnery, and carefully coordinated movement. None of that worked against opponents who refused to fight on their terms. Hellcats struck from unexpected angles, at unpredictable moments, and were gone before those pre-positioned guns could react. Infantry screens struggled to keep pace. Artillery strikes landed on empty ground. Even when a Panther caught sight of its attacker, the odds were stacked against it. By the time its turret traversed, the Hellcat was already accelerating toward its next position, engine screaming, suspension flexing like a hunting cat, springing away. More than once, German crews reported the same helpless feeling, seeing the muzzle flash, spinning their turrets in vain, and firing at nothing but fog and memory. Years of training for methodical tank warfare couldn't be undone in months. The Wehrmacht had built its armor to dominate the battlefield through power. The Hellcat beat them by refusing to stay still long enough to be dominated. While German factories struggled under bombing raids and material shortages, across the Atlantic the Buick Motor Division of General Motors turned out M18 Hellcats with the precision and speed of an assembly line built for war. Unlike the complex Panthers and Tigers, the Hellcat was engineered to be produced in numbers. Between 1943 and 1944, 2,507 vehicles rolled out of American plants. Each cost roughly $55,000, a fraction of what a Panther demanded in Reichsmarks and man-hours. Where the German machines were meticulously hand-fitted, the Hellcat was designed like a car, modular, standardized, and easy to assemble. Its lightweight chassis didn't just make it fast, it made it easy to build. The power came from a Wright R975 radial engine, an aircraft design adapted to armored warfare. It was already being mass-produced for planes, which meant parts and mechanics were readily available. No fragile radiators, no complex cooling systems, air-cooled, simple, and brutally effective. The transmission was equally revolutionary. The Torque-O-Matic automatic gearbox gave the Hellcat smooth acceleration and freed the driver from wrestling with manual clutching under fire. In a fight measured in seconds, that mattered. But building the machine was only half the story. The other half was training the men who would wield it. At Camp Hood, Texas, specialized programs turned recruits into Hellcat crews. Drivers learned to push the vehicle to its limit, weaving over rough terrain at high speed, braking sharply, and positioning for quick shots. Gunners trained for rapid acquisition, firing accurately at moderate ranges, not waiting for perfect aim. And commanders were taught something that couldn't be measured in calibers or horsepower: anticipation. They had to think 2 moves ahead, always planning the next firing position before the first shot was even fired. Unlike heavy tank crews, Hellcat teams were chosen for their comfort with risk. They had to be quick thinkers, aggressive, but calculating, willing to trust speed over steel. Inside a Hellcat, There was no illusion of invincibility. The armor was paper-thin. But the crews learned to use that vulnerability as fuel, a constant reminder that hesitation meant death. It created a fighting culture built on mobility, precision, and nerve. Detroit gave them the machine. Camp Hood gave them the mindset. Together, they forged a force that could make a 17-ton vehicle feel unstoppable. For all its speed, the M18 Hellcat carried a truth that every crewman felt the moment he climbed inside. They were fighting in a thin-skinned machine. Its thickest armor, just 25 millimeters on the turret front, could barely stop a heavy machine gun. Side plates were thinner still, vulnerable to artillery fragments, anti-tank rifles, and even concentrated small arms fire at close range. A single hit from a Panther's 75 gun or a Tiger's 88 could shred the vehicle like paper. Hellcat crews knew this intimately. They didn't talk about it much. They didn't have to. It was the air they breathed in combat. This fragility shaped every second of their tactics. Hellcats never lingered. A standard engagement drill drilled into every crewman's muscle memory went like this: fire 3 to 5 rounds, displace immediately by at least 200 yards, and reappear from another angle. Never, under any circumstance, remain stationary under enemy observation for more than a minute. Urban fights were avoided. Open terrain was chosen for speed. Infantry support was coordinated to keep enemy tank hunters at bay. Terrain masking, using ridge lines, woods, and folds in the earth, became second nature. The speed of the machine wasn't just a performance spec, it was their only armor. This constant edge gave Hellcat crews a distinctive psychological profile. Unlike crews of heavy tanks who could rely on their armor to absorb punishment, Hellcat teams lived by reflex and nerve. They trained themselves to make decisions instantly, to trust their instincts as much as their instruments. Many veterans later recalled the strange duality of the Hellcat. It felt terrifyingly fragile and exhilaratingly alive. It was like sitting in a tin can, one gunner remembered, but a tin can that could outrun death if you pushed it hard enough. That paradox forged a particular kind of soldier, calm under pressure, fiercely alert, and willing to gamble everything on movement. The thin armor that could have been a weakness became the engine of their aggression. They didn't win by being harder to kill. They won by never giving the enemy the chance to aim. By the final year of the war, the numbers told a story as sharp as any after-action report. The M18 Hellcat had entered combat as an idea, a machine built around speed, but it ended the war as a proven weapon system with a track record etched in hard data. Across the European theater, M18-equipped tank destroyer battalions achieved a kill-to-loss ratio of roughly 2.3 to 1. For every Hellcat knocked out, more than 2 German armored vehicles were destroyed. Some battalions outperformed even that. The 704th recorded 106 confirmed tank kills. The 705th, 89. Others, like the 603rd and 69th, posted dozens more. Engagements were fast and violent. The average combat lasted just over 2 minutes, with most kills occurring within 600 to 700 meters. Hellcats didn't stalk prey for hours. They hit, broke contact, and repositioned. But the statistics revealed something unexpected. Hellcats spent only about 30% of their time hunting tanks. The rest of the time, they supported infantry, blasting bunkers, harassing convoys, countering strongpoints. The doctrine envisioned massed armored thrusts. Reality delivered scattered skirmishes and support actions. Even so, the Hellcat's impact was undeniable. The German Panther, heavier, more powerful on paper, often found itself reacting to engagements it didn't control. Hellcats dictated when and where to fight. That flexibility magnified their effectiveness far beyond their numbers. Losses were inevitable. By spring 1945, more than 200 Hellcats had been destroyed in combat. But another statistic stood out: the crew survival rate. When a Hellcat was knocked out, hovered around 73%. Speed and mobility often gave crews the chance to bail out and live to fight another day, a luxury Panther crews didn't always have. On paper, the Hellcat hadn't revolutionized tank warfare through overwhelming numbers. Instead, it carved its legacy through efficiency. It made each engagement count, punishing slower, heavier opponents through maneuver rather than brute force. The battlefield doesn't care about blueprints. It rewards what works. And for a thin-skinned machine with the heart of a race car, what worked was moving faster than the enemy could think. When the guns of Europe finally fell silent, the M18 Hellcat's combat record became more than history. It became a blueprint. The war had proven that armor alone no longer defined dominance. Mobility had rewritten the battlefield. Doctrines around the world shifted in the years that followed. In the Soviet Union, engineers drew lessons from the Hellcat's agility, designing the PT-76 amphibious tank light, fast, and meant to exploit speed rather than brute protection. Later, their BMP infantry fighting vehicles carried the same DNA: outmaneuver first, outfight second. In Britain, the CVR-T Scorpion series embodied a similar logic: recon vehicles that could strike quickly and relocate faster than an enemy could counter. France pursued the AMX-13, a light tank with an automatic loader that sacrificed armor for speed and mobility. Even post-war West Germany, the land of the Panther and Tiger, abandoned heavy armor doctrine with the Leopard 1, built not as an indestructible fortress, but as a highly mobile, sharp-edged blade. The Hellcat's influence didn't stop at tracked vehicles. Modern wheeled tank destroyers like Italy's Centauro, Japan's Type 16, and America's M1128 mobile gun system all trace their lineage to the same philosophy: sometimes it's better to avoid being hit than to try to survive the hit. What made the Hellcat unique wasn't just its speed, it was the concept behind it. Instead of building more armor to match the enemy, it broke the mold entirely. It proved that an army could fight asymmetrically, not by matching strength, but by exploiting weakness in tempo and doctrine. This shift echoed through Cold War strategy. The notion of shoot and scoot, once radical, became standard for mobile anti-tank forces around the world. The Hellcat's ghost was present in every fast-moving armored battalion that valued agility over mass. Even decades later, when high-tech sensors and active protection systems dominate modern battlefields, the lesson remains clear: speed is a weapon. And that lesson was first written into steel by a 17-ton machine built in Detroit. In war, there are machines that fight battles, and there are machines that change them. The M18 Hellcat belonged to the second kind. When it first screamed through the fog at Arracourt, it didn't just burn German tanks, it burned away old assumptions about how armor should fight. The Panther and the Tiger were monuments to power. The Hellcat was a whisper of something different, a reminder that the faster hunter decides the terms of the hunt. German crews, once accustomed to watching Shermans burn, suddenly found themselves staring into muzzle flashes they couldn't track. They spun their turrets in vain, realizing they weren't the predators anymore. They were the prey. Many veterans would later say that it wasn't the shells that unnerved them most. It was the sound of those engines in the fog. The Americans who crewed the Hellcat never saw it as invincible. They knew exactly how fragile it was. But that fragility sharpened them. It forced them to act fast, think faster, and trust in movement more than armor. One veteran put it simply: we lived by 3 rules: shoot fast, move fast, think fast. If you failed at any one of them, you didn't come home. This machine didn't win through overwhelming firepower. It won through audacity, through the simple, brutal logic that what can't be hit can't be killed. It turned speed into survival, mobility into strategy, and fear into a weapon aimed at the enemy's doctrine. Today, long after the last Hellcat left the battlefield, Its shadow lingers. Every time a commander chooses agility over armor, every time a designer prioritizes speed over steel, every time a doctrine embraces maneuver over brute strength, the Hellcat's lesson echoes. It wasn't just a tank destroyer. It was a philosophy in motion. As German armor lay burning at Arracourt, in the Ardennes fog and across countless skirmishes, one truth became impossible to ignore. The most dangerous weapon isn't always the biggest gun or the thickest armor. Sometimes, it's the machine that refuses to stand still. The M18 Hellcat outran more than German tanks. It outran their doctrine, their expectations, their control of the battlefield, and in doing so, it left a legacy far faster and far louder than anyone expected.